Welcome back. This afternoon we have Bob Brandemer's fourth lecture entitled Modality and Normativity from Hume and Quine to Kant and Hegel. And we will follow. Oh, mine it says. I'm told that the true title is To Kant and Sellers, but not To Kant and Hegel. But I have a misprint. Anyway, we'll follow the normal format. First Bob's lecture, then at a half-an-hour break, then the comment on it by Hugh Price, and then open discussion until 6 o'clock. Thank you, Bob.
I've been accused of not being able to tell the difference between Sellers and Hegel in any case, so maybe this is just appropriate. The status and respectability of alethic modality was always a point of contention and divergence between naturalism and empiricism. I mean, we see this in the Vienna Circle, where that was the source of the great divide. Modality poses no problems at all, in principle, for naturalism, because modal vocabulary is already an integral part of all the candidate naturalistic base vocabularies. Fundamental physics is the language of laws. The special sciences all distinguish between true and false counterfactual claims, and ordinary empirical talk is richly dispositional. By contrast, modality has always been a stumbling block for the empiricist tradition, ever since Hume forcefully formulated his epistemological, and I think ultimately semantic, objections to the concepts of law and necessary connection. Those traditional reservations about the intelligibility of modal notions were underscored, reinforced, and confirmed for the 20th century versions of empiricism, which had been distinguished, strengthened, and made more precise by the addition of the semantic logicist model of the conceptual articulation of empirical concepts. Extensional first-order quantificational languages could express regularities and generalizations with hitherto undreamed of power and precision. But for philosophers from Russell through Carnap to Quine, that just made it all the more urgent to explain, or explain away, the law-likeness or counterfactual supporting necessity distinctive of at least some of those generalizations, which demonstrably extended beyond what could be captured by the expressive resources of that logical vocabulary. This confluence of traditional empiricists with logicist difficulties concerning the content expressed by modal vocabulary had the result that for roughly the first two-thirds of the 20th century, Anglophone philosophy regarded alethic modality with extreme suspicion, if not outright hostility. It ranked with normative vocabulary as among the most mysterious and philosophically puzzling forms of discourse, the source of central standing and outstanding philosophical problems, a prime candidate for the analytic project of semantic clarification in favored terms, or failing that, principled elimination from perspicuous discourse. But philosophical attitudes towards modality underwent a remarkable, I think in many ways unprecedentedly radical transformation during the 20th century. For starting in the second half of the century and accelerating through the last third, modal vocabulary became the analytic semanticist's best friend and an essential part of the contemporary philosopher's metaconceptual toolkit. I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves just how surprised and astonished philosophers who lived and moved and had their being in the earlier milieu would have been to discover that by the end of their century, when questions were raised, say, about the semantics of some vocabulary, normative, intentional, or even semantic vocabulary itself, not only the dominant strategy, but the very first recourse would be to appeal to modal notions, such as dispositions, counterfactual dependencies, and nomological relations to explain the questionable conceptual contents. Just how, they would want to know, did what seemed most urgently in need of philosophical explanation and defense rather suddenly become transformed so as to become unproblematically available to explain other puzzling phenomena? Surely such a major transformation of explanandum into explanans couldn't be the result merely of change of fashion, the onset of amnesia, or the accumulation of fatigue. But if not, what secret did we find out? What new understanding did we achieve to justify this change of philosophical attitude and practice? Two answers to this question lie ready to hand. First, there was a formal semantic revolution in modal logic. And second, the Anglophone tradition more or less gave up empiricism in favor of naturalism. I think both of these explanations are right as far as they go, both as matters of historical fact and in the order of justification. But it's important to understand exactly which questions those developments did offer responsive answers to, and to which they did not. As to the first point, I think there's a widespread tendency to think that, to paraphrase Alexander Pope, modality and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Kripke be," and all was light. But that can't be right. Kripke's provision of a complete extensional semantic metavocabulary for intentional modal logical vocabulary, and then its powerful development by others such as Montague, Scott, Kaplan, Lewis, and Stolnecker into a general intentional semantics for non-logical vocabulary, is an adequate response to worries stemming from the extensional character of the logical vocabulary in which semantics had been conducted. That is, it addresses the difficulty on the semantic logicist side of the classical project of analysis that stemmed from the expressive impoverishment of first-order logical vocabulary. But these formal developments do not provide an adequate response to the residual empiricist worries about the intelligibility of modal concepts. For the extensionality of the semantic meta-language for modality is bought at the price of making free use of modal primitives, most centrally the notion of a possible world. As Quine emphasized, the modal vocabulary whose use is essential to this semantic approach evidently falls within the circle of terms and concepts to which empiricist suspicions and questions apply. Whether possible worlds are thought of as abstract objects, as concrete particulars spatio-temporally unconnected to our universe, or as sui generis possibilia, the epistemological question of how we're to understand the possibility of our knowing anything about such items, and the question how, if the possibility of such cognitive contact is mysterious, the idea of our having the semantic contact necessary so much as to talk or think about them can be made intelligible, are left wholly untouched by this formal apparatus and remain every bit as pressing as before. Now, how urgent those questions are depends on whether we have grounds to accept criticisms of the empiricist program that undermine the basis for its relegation of modal vocabulary to suspect second-class status. I think that the best justification for our new comfort with modal idioms is indeed to be found in the principled rejection of some of the crucial presuppositions of the empiricist critique of the credentials of modal concepts. We can now see that the operative core of both Quine's and Sellers' arguments against empiricism consist in objections to its underlying semantic atomism. Arguing that meaning must at least determine inferential role, and noticing that what follows from or is evidence against a claim depends on what other claims are available as auxiliary hypotheses or collateral premises, Quine concludes that the smallest unit of meaning is not a sentence, even in the case of observation sentences, but what he calls a theory, the whole constellation of all sentences held true, articulated by their inferential relations both to one another and to sentences not held true. Sellers argues that even observational beliefs acquired non-inferentially through perception can be understood as conceptually contentful and hence potentially cognitively significant only in virtue of their inferential relations to other possible beliefs. He concludes that non-inferential reports, no matter what their subject matter, can't constitute an autonomous discursive practice, a language game one could play though one played no other. Now I take it it's clear how these anti-atomist arguments bear against empiricist foundationalism, that is, the layer cake picture of a semantically autonomous base of perceptual experience or reports thereof on which is erected a semantically optional superstructure, in effect, of theories inferentially based on those observations. And insofar as empiricist worries about the status of laws, necessary connections, dispositions, and counterfactual possibilities are predicated on the difficulty of justifying the inferences that would add them to the supposedly semantically autonomous base of non-modal reports of actual experiences, Quine's and Sellers' assault on the layer cake picture, if successful, undercuts those worries by removing the motivation for their ultimately unmeetable constraints on the account of what modal vocabulary expresses. Thought of this way, though, criticism of the semantic presuppositions of the empiricist project as a whole doesn't bear any more directly on its treatment of modal vocabulary than on its treatment of any other potentially puzzling candidate for empiricist explanation: theoretical vocabulary, normative vocabulary, or even probabilistic vocabulary. And it hasn't led to the same level of comfort with, say, normative vocabulary. But there is another, much more intimate and immediate positive connection between arguments against semantic atomism and our understanding of what's expressed by the use of modal vocabulary. And it's here, I think, we can find the best justification for our current relaxed attitude toward and even enthusiastic embrace of modal idioms as suitable tools for serious analytic semantic work. The underlying idea is what I'm going to call the Kant-Sellers thesis about modality. Hume found that even his best understanding of actual observable empirical facts didn't yield an understanding of rules relating or otherwise governing them. Those facts did not settle which of the things that actually happened had to happen, given others, that is, were at least conditionally necessary, and which of the things that did not happen nonetheless were possible, that is, not ruled out by laws concerning what did happen. Hume, and following him Quine, took it that epistemologically and semantically fastidious philosophers faced a stark choice: either show how to explain modality in non-modal terms or learn to live without it. But that challenge is predicated on the idea of an independently and antecedently intelligible stratum of empirical discourse that's purely descriptive and involves no modal commitments, as a semantically autonomous background and model with which the credentials of modal discourse can then be invidiously compared. So just doing in empiricism won't solve the problem here, because now there's a question of whether non-modal discourse can be an autonomous base language, whether you conceive that in empiricist terms or not. One of Kant's most basic ideas, revived by Sellers, is that this idea is mistaken. The ability to use ordinary empirical descriptive terms, such as green, rigid, and mass, already presupposes grasp of the kinds of properties and relations that are made explicit by modal vocabulary. Sellers summed this claim up admirably in the title of one of his early papers, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them. See, that's a pellucid title. The rest of the essay is completely unintelligible, but it's a wonderful title. Kant was struck by the fact that the essence of the Newtonian concept of mass is of something that by law, force is both necessary and sufficient to accelerate. And he saw further that all empirical concepts are like their refined descendants in the mathematized natural sciences in this respect. Their application implicitly involves counterfactual supporting dispositional commitments to what would happen if. Kant's claim, put in contemporary terms, is that an integral part of what one's committed to in applying any determinate concept in empirical circumstances is drawing a distinction between counterfactual differences in circumstances that would, and those that would not, affect the truth of the judgment one is making. One has not grasped the concept cat unless one knows that it would still be possible for the cat to be on the mat if the lighting had been slightly different, but not if all life on Earth had been extinguished by an asteroid strike. In an autobiographical sketch, Sellers dates his break with traditional empiricism to his Oxford days in the 30s. It was, he says, prompted by concern with the sort of content that ought to be associated with logical, causal, and deontological modalities. Already at that point, he says, he had the idea that, quote, what was needed was a functional theory of concepts, which would make their role in reasoning, rather than their supposed origin in experience, their primary feature, end of the quote. Somewhat more specifically, he sees modal locutions as tools used in the enterprise of, again, quote, making explicit the rules we have adopted for thought and action. I shall be interpreting our judgments, he says, to the effect that A causally necessitates B as the expression of a rule governing our use of the terms A and B, end of that quote. In fact, following Ryle, he takes modal expressions to function as inference licenses, expressing our commitment to the goodness of counterfactually robust inferences from necessitating to necessitated conditions. If and insofar as it could be established that their involvement in such counterfactually robust inferences is essential to the contents of ordinary empirical concepts, then what's made explicit by modal vocabulary would turn out to be implicit in any use of such concepts. That's the claim I'm calling the Kant-Sellers thesis. On this view, modal vocabulary does not just add to the use of our ordinary empirical observational vocabulary a range of expressive power that's extraneous, as though one were adding, say, culinary to nautical vocabulary. Rather, the expressive job distinctive of modal vocabulary is to articulate just the kind of essential semantic connections among empirical concepts that Sellers and even Quine point to and whose existence semantic atomism is principally concerned to deny. As I'd like to formulate it, the Kant-Sellers thesis begins with the claim that in using ordinary empirical vocabulary, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to introduce and deploy modal vocabulary. If that's right, then one can't be in the position that the atomist, critic of modality, of which the empiricist critic is just one kind, professes to find himself in, having fully understood and mastered the use of non-modal vocabulary, but having thereby afforded himself no grip on the use of modal vocabulary and no access to what it expresses. The Humean-Quinean predicament is accordingly diagnosed as resulting from a failure properly to understand the relation between modal vocabulary and what one must do in order to deploy non-modal, for instance, empirical descriptive vocabulary. The thought that the expressive role characteristic of a lethic modal vocabulary is to make explicit semantic or conceptual connections and commitments that are already implicit in the use of ordinary, apparently non-modal empirical vocabulary, faces at the outset at least two serious sorts of objection. First, didn't Kripke's semantic investigations of modally rigid designators reveal the sort of necessity they articulate as being metaphysical, specifically by contrast to the sort of conceptual necessity that Quine, for instance, had worried about and then rejected? And second, to talk about what's necessary and possible is surely not to say anything about rules for using linguistic expressions or about what anyone is committed to, since the objective modal claims in question could be true even if there'd never been language users, linguistic expressions, rules, or commitments. As to the first objection, the philosophical phase of the modal revolution, I think of the modal revolution as having three phases. The logical phase, Kripke's completeness proofs for modal logic, the semantic phase, the extension of that apparatus to provide an intentional logic for non-logical expressions, the philosophical phase of the modal revolution that Kripke precipitated in Naming and Necessity did indeed use the semantic phenomenon of modal rigidity of some non-descriptive vocabulary to articulate a kind of necessity that's knowable only a posteriori. The conclusion that such necessity should not be understood as conceptual necessity would follow only if one either identifies conceptual content with descriptive content, by contrast, say, to the causal historically acquired content characteristic of proper names and demonstratives, or takes it, as Quine following the tradition had, that conceptual connections must be knowable a priori by those who have mastered those concepts. But both of those are optional commitments, which can and should be rejected by anybody trying to follow out the Kant-Sellers line of thought about modality. John McDowell has argued, to my mind convincingly, that the content expressed by demonstrative vocabulary should be understood as thoroughly conceptual, and indeed that Frege already took it to be so. And in making it explicit, I articulate a broadly inferential notion of the conceptual that incorporates the indirectly inferential roles of substitution and anaphora, including the anaphoric phenomenon that is modal rigidity. On the other point, Sellers' forthright response to Quine's pragmatic challenge in Two Dogmas to say what it is about the use of expressions that distinguishes inferences underwritten by necessary conceptual relations from those underwritten just by contingent matter-of-factual ones, Sellers' response to that challenge is to identify the concept articulating inferences just with those that are counterfactually robust. He cheerfully embraces the consequence that to discover what's contained in the concept copper, one needs empirically to investigate the laws of nature. The issue about conceptual necessities here is not an empirical one. Who's right about the conceptual? The Kant-Sellers thesis about modality requires deploying a concept of the conceptual that differs in important ways from the traditional one. We don't just have a priori access to the conceptual. As long as such a notion can be intelligibly developed and consistently applied, those differences need only be kept firmly in mind, not counted as fatal flaws. The response to the second objection must be to be clearer about the sort of pragmatically mediated semantic relation the Kant-Sellers thesis takes modal vocabulary to stand in to ordinary vocabulary. The large claim in the vicinity, the one that will occupy me not only in this lecture, but beyond, is, as Sellers puts it, that the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. Now, Sellers says this a number of times. I don't think Sellers himself ever manages to say clearly just what sort of transposition he has in mind. He appeals to a distinction between what's said by the use of some vocabulary and what's conveyed by its use. While admitting that talk of what's necessary does not say anything about what language users ought or ought not to do, he nonetheless insists that it, quote, conveys the same information as rules to the effect that we may do thus and so and ought not to do this and that in the way of manipulating expressions in the language. His example, only somewhat helpful I think, is that when I say the sky is clear, I've both said something about the weather and conveyed something about my beliefs. The point, I take it, is to distinguish what follows semantically from the content of what I've said from what follows pragmatically from my saying of it. One way to distinguish these two is to embed claims as the antecedents of conditionals. If the sky is clear, then it will not rain expresses a good inference, whereas if the sky is clear, then Brandon believes the sky is clear does not. For only the semantic content and not the pragmatic force of the utterance survives such embedding. But we're in a position to be a little bit clearer about what Sellers is after with his dark notion of what an utterance doesn't say but merely conveys. The view, as I understand it, is that what I'm doing when I say that it's causally necessary that if this piece of copper is heated to 1084 degrees C, it will melt, is endorsing a certain kind of inference. I'm not saying that the inference is good. The facts about copper would be as they were even if there were no inferers or inferrings. When Sellers says the language of modality is a transposed language of norms, he's saying in my terms that normative vocabulary, codifying rules of inference, is a pragmatic metavocabulary for modal vocabulary. His transposition is just this pragmatically mediated semantic relation between deontic normative and alethic modal vocabulary. The corresponding meaning-use diagram is the first one on your handout, labeled the language of modalities as a transposed language of norms. In my lecture tomorrow morning, I'll show in detail how this thought can be exploited to develop a new sort of formal semantics, which yields new insights into the conceptual contents expressed by ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, as well as logical and modal vocabularies. This claim is merely part of the background, however, of what I've been calling the Kant-Sellers thesis about modality. That thesis comprises two claims. First, in using ordinary empirical vocabulary, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to introduce and deploy modal vocabulary. And second, the expressive role characteristic of alethic modal vocabulary is to make explicit semantic conceptual connections and commitments that are already implicit in the use of ordinary empirical vocabulary. The first says that some practices that are PV necessary for the use of any empirical vocabulary are PP sufficient for practices that are PV sufficient to deploy modal vocabulary. And the second says that modal vocabulary then makes explicit those aspects of practices or abilities that are implicit in the use of any empirical vocabulary. In fact, these are ways of saying that modal vocabulary stands to ordinary empirical vocabulary in the complex pragmatically mediated semantic relation I've already identified as elaborating explicitating, the meaning-use relation I'm calling LX for short. And the corresponding meaning-use diagram is the second one on your handout, the Kant-Sellers thesis. And we can put the transposition claim together with the LXness claim, the Kant-Sellers thesis, yielding a more complicated meaning-use diagram that asserts relations among modal, normative, and empirical vocabularies. And that's the third diagram on your handout. Now, so far, I've only expounded, explicated, and mentioned some of the consequences of the Kant-Sellers thesis about modal vocabulary, but I haven't sought to argue for it. What reason might one have to think it's true? The analysis of the Kant-Sellers thesis as asserting a complex, pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabularies that's the resultant of a definite constellation of basic meaning-use relations, as presented in the meaning-use diagram, tells us exactly what shape an argument must have, for it tells us exactly which basic meaning-use relations must be established in order to show that the resultant one obtains. That's why it presents an analysis of it. The key element will be finding some set of practices that can be argued to be at once contained in or exhibited by every autonomous discursive practice, and PP sufficient for practices PV sufficient for deploying explicitly modal vocabulary, which can then be used to make explicit, is then VP sufficient to make explicit those very features. As the labels on the meaning use diagrams indicate, for the argument that I'll mount, picking up on the theme on which my argument from this morning turned, those practices are counterfactually robust inferential practices or abilities. More specifically, the practical capacity to associate with materially good inferences ranges of counterfactual robustness. If it can be established that deploying ordinary empirical vocabulary presupposes those practices or abilities, and that they in turn suffice to introduce explicitly modally qualified conditionals that permit the expression of those practical discriminations, then the LX character of modal vocabulary relative to ordinary empirical vocabulary will have been established. Now, I've already claimed that any autonomous discursive practice must include practices or abilities of distinguishing some inferences as materially good from others that are not. For some bit of vocabulary to function as a propositionally contentful declarative sentence is for it to be available to serve as the premise and conclusion of such material inferences. Further, it's the expressive job generically characteristic of conditional vocabulary to codify endorsements of material inferences, to make them explicit in the form of declarative sentences that can themselves serve as the premises and conclusions of inferences. The philosopher most responsible for getting us to think about conditionals this way is Gilbert Ryle. In his classic essay, If, So, and Because, in which he introduces the idea of hypothetical statements as inference tickets or licenses, he also points out an intimate connection between them and modal claims. He says, this is an extended quote that's in your handout, "We have another familiar way of wording hypothetical statements. Although the standard textbooks discuss modal propositions in a different chapter from that in which they discuss hypotheticals, the difference between modal and hypothetical statements is in fact purely stylistic. There's only one colloquial way of correctly negating the superstitious hypothetical statement: if a person walks under a ladder, he comes to grief before the day is out. Namely, by saying, no, a person may, might, or could walk under a ladder and not come to grief. And the only colloquial way of putting a question to which an if-then statement is the required affirmative answer is to ask, for example, can an Oxford vice-chancellor not be, or need he be, a head of college? We can always reword an if-then statement as a statement of the pattern, it cannot be Monday today and not be Tuesday tomorrow." End of the quote. I think he's right. Well, in general, I wouldn't say that there was a merely stylistic difference between these, but I think he's right that it's possible that P and not Q is incompatible with if P and Q, when the latter is used to codify an ordinary material inference, such as the inference from a banana's being yellow to its being ripe. Endorsing a material inference does involve a commitment of the sort made explicit by the use of modal vocabulary about what is and is not possible and what is at least conditionally necessary. So there's an intimate relation between what's expressed by modal vocabulary and what's expressed by conditionals, namely inferential connections. That's the point. For this reason, the fact that we cannot intelligibly describe someone as deploying a concept unless he can make some distinction between materially good and bad inferences involving it has the consequence that we also cannot understand the practitioner as deploying the concept unless he treats the material inferences he takes to be good as having a certain range of counterfactual robustness, that is, as remaining good under various merely hypothetical circumstances. One grasps the claim, the lioness is hungry, only insofar as one takes it to have various consequences, which would be true if it were true, and to rule out some others, which would not be true if it were true. And it's not intelligible that one should endorse as materially good an inference involving it, such as the inference from the lioness is hungry to nearby prey animals visible to and accessible by the lioness are in danger of being eaten, but be disposed to make no distinction at all between collateral premises that would and those that would not infirm the inference. One must make some distinction, such as that the inference would still go through if the lioness were standing 2 inches to the east of where she actually is, the day happened to be Tuesday, or a small tree 10 miles away cast its shadow over a beetle, but not if she were shot with a tranquilizing dart, the temperature instantly plummeted 300 degrees, or a plane crashed, crushing her. The claim is not that one could not fail to assess some or even all of these particular counterfactuals correctly and still count as grasping the claim that is their premise, but rather that one could not so qualify if one simply made no such distinctions. It might be initially tempting to think that the inferences that are counterfactually robust are all and only those underwritten by laws. So inferences underwritten by the law that all samples of copper melt at 1083.4 degrees C are counterfactually robust. If this coin, which in fact is silver, were made of copper, it would melt at 1083.4 degrees C. Whereas inferences underwritten by the accidental regularity that all the coins in my pocket are copper are not counterfactually robust. If I were to put this coin, which in fact is silver, in my pocket, it would not be copper. There are indeed real and significant differences between these cases, but I think it's important not to think of them in terms of the difference between inferences that are counterfactually robust and inferences that are not. The difference is rather one of the character of the particular ranges of counterfactual robustness. For even the accidental generalization that all the coins in my pocket are copper does underwrite counterfactuals, such as if I were to choose a coin at random from my pocket, it would be copper. In fact, every claim, whether it itself is contingent or not, supports some counterfactual inferences, and if one grasped none of them, one would not qualify as understanding that claim. I think these considerations suffice to establish that autonomous discursive practices are essentially, and not just accidentally, involving the association of ranges of counterfactual robustness with at least some material inferences. If, as Ryle claims, and as is in any case plausible, modal vocabulary specifying what is at least conditionally possible and necessary can then be introduced to make explicit those commitments to the at least limited counterfactual goodness of material inferences, then we'd have what's needed for the modal Kant-Sellers thesis. But I think if we dig a little bit deeper, we can learn more. So rather than leaving things at this point, I want to consider a more detailed line of argument for this, the most potentially controversial element of the complex meaning-use relation that the Kant-Sellers thesis asserts. For the first premise, I take it to be clear that every autonomous discursive practice must have some vocabulary that can be used observationally in reliably differentially elicited non-inferential reports. This is the core of what I've been referring to as ordinary empirical vocabulary. Second, I've already argued that those who engage in any discursive practices must distinguish in practice between materially good and materially bad inferences, where calling them material just means that the presence of some non-logical vocabulary is essential to whether they're good or bad. Recall that this is not to claim that they must have a view about the goodness or badness of every possible candidate material inference. There can be some about which they have no view. And it's not to claim that they must always be correct about the goodness of the inferences towards which they do have attitudes. But to count as deploying any vocabulary at all, one must treat some inferences involving it as good and others as bad. Otherwise, one's utterances are wholly devoid of conceptual content. Whatever pragmatic significance they may have, as, say, ouch does, it can't be thought of as discursive significance. Even tokenings that are non-inferentially elicited by environing stimuli, ouch again, that is, the applications of observational vocabulary mentioned in the first premise, have to have inferential consequences if they're not to be cognitively idle. The third claim is that material inference is in general non-monotonic. That is, the inference from P to Q may be materially good, even though the inference from P and R to Q is not. Monotonicity of inference is, of course, a familiar feature of inferences within formal logical systems and in most mathematical reasoning, and that feature is arguably inherited by, for instance, fundamental physics. But in the special sciences, inferences are almost always defeasible by collateral circumstances that thereby count as special in some way. Each stage in a physician's differential diagnosis is like this. The inference from test result, physical finding, or symptom is surrounded by a nimbus of usually unspoken unlesses. And no one supposes that such probative reasoning can always be turned into dispositive reasoning by making an explicit, exhaustive list of the potential defeasors. Certainly, reasoning in everyday life does not generally admit such completions. If I strike this dry, well-made match, it will light, unless I do it inside a strong enough magnetic field. But if I do it inside a strong magnetic field, it still will light if, in addition, I'm inside a Faraday cage, unless there's not enough oxygen, and so on. There need be no definite totality of possible defeasors specifiable in advance. Even where we have some idea how to enumerate them, unless those provisos are generally left implicit, actually stating the premises so as to draw inferences from them monotonically is impossibly cumbersome in practice. At this point, one is liable to think of ceteris paribus clauses. After all, the careful way to formulate the ordinary inference I just mentioned is that if I strike this dry, well-made match, ceteris paribus, or other things being equal, it will light. Well, I think indeed that's exactly what we ought to say. And the point I want to make can be made by saying that what such ceteris paribus clauses mark is an unavoidable feature of ordinary material inferences. But it's critical to understand what such clauses do and do not do. They are not devices for the wholesale stipulation of the denial of all the potential defeasors, which even if exhaustively knowable and statable, if denied retail, would still make the inference unsurveyable. That is, ceteris paribus clauses are not devices that make originally non-monotonic inferences into monotonic ones. The proper term for a Latin phrase that can do that would be magic spell. If it's thought of as a wholesale proviso covering all possible defeasors, the effect of adding ceteris paribus to the statement of the inference that if I strike this dry, well-made match, then it will light, would be to say, unless for some reason it doesn't, or except in those circumstances where it doesn't. That's not producing an inference that's monotonic, it's producing one that's trivial. The real expressive function of ceteris paribus clauses is not magically to remove or repair the non-monotonicity of material inferences, nor to replace them with others that are monotonic, but rather explicitly to acknowledge their non-monotonicity, to mark the inference being endorsed as one that has unspecified but potentially important defeasors. So it is an explicitating device. It explicitly marks the non-monotonicity. The fourth premise of my argument is that at any given time, many, if not most, of a subject's beliefs could only be justified by exhibiting them as the conclusions of material inferences. We might call a believer epistemically responsible insofar as she acknowledges a commitment to being able to justify at least many, if not most, of her beliefs, at least under suitable circumstances. My fifth premise is that in order to count as a discursive practitioner, one must be at least minimally epistemically responsible. Happily, present purposes won't require that we attempt to quantify what the minimal level of such responsibility might be. Developing a theme then for my previous lecture, we can draw a preliminary conclusion. The 5 considerations that I've just advanced together entail that epistemically responsible believers face a potentially intractable updating problem. Every change of belief, no matter how small, is potentially relevant to the justification of every prior belief. Acquiring a new belief means acquiring what, for any material inference the believer endorses and relies on for justification, might possibly turn out to be a defeasor. And giving up any belief means giving up not only a premise that might previously have been relied on in justification, but also a potential counter-defeasor. For instance, a magnetic field's not being a defeasor to the match's lighting if there is a Faraday cage. Now, it's not practically feasible explicitly to review all of one's beliefs every time any of one's beliefs change, in order to check which are and which are not still justifiable. If that were what epistemic responsibility demanded, then it would be a pointless, impossible ideal. Language users who do not, because they cannot, do that, still must practically distinguish among all the inferences that rationalize their current beliefs, which of them are update candidates in the light of the current change of belief, let's say for simplicity, a newly added belief. That is practically to associate with the new belief a set of material inferences of which it's a potential diffeasor. The potential diffeasors in this way associated with each material inference endorsed in turn define a range of counterfactual robustness that's practically associated with that inference. I conclude that in view of the non-monotonicity of material inference, the practical task of updating the rest of one's beliefs when some of them change is tractable in principle only if those who deploy a vocabulary practically discriminate ranges of counterfactual robustness for many of the material inferences they endorse. If that's right, then establishing the modal Kant-Sellers thesis requires further showing how to introduce modal vocabulary on the basis of such counterfactual conditionals, and how then to use modal vocabulary to make those counterfactual conditionals explicit. Ryle's remarks suggest a strategy for both. Treat if P were true, Q would be true, as equivalent to it's not possible that P and not Q. In the next lecture, I'll show how to follow out this strategy in detail by treating the claim that Q follows from P as equivalent to the claim that everything materially incompatible with Q is materially incompatible with P. So that to say Coda is a dog entails Coda is a mammal is to say that everything incompatible with being a mammal is incompatible with being a dog. Before turning to that project of connecting material inferential relations with the implicitly modal notion of incompatibility, however, I want to consider an analog of the Kant-Sellers thesis about modal vocabulary that applies it instead to normative vocabulary. Kant read Hume's theoretical and practical philosophies as raising variants of a single question. On the side of theoretical reasoning, Hume asks what our warrant is for moving from descriptions of what in fact happens to characterizations of what must happen and what could not happen. How, he wants to know, can we rationally justify the move from descriptions of matter-of-factual regularities to formulations of necessary laws? On the side of practical reasoning, Hume asks what our warrant is for moving from descriptions of how things are to prescriptions of how they ought to be. How, he wants to know, can we rationally justify the move from is to ought? In Kant's terminology, these are both species of necessity, practical and natural necessity, respectively. For Kant, necessary, notwendig, just means according to a rule. Hume's predicament is that he finds that even his best understanding of facts doesn't yield an understanding of rules governing and relating those facts, underwriting assessments of which of the things that actually happen must happen, that is, are naturally necessary, or ought to happen, are normatively or practically necessary. As we've seen, on the modal side, Kant's response is that Hume's predicament is not a real one. One cannot, in fact, fully understand the descriptive empirical employment of ordinary determinate concepts such as cat, the ones you use in formulating matter-of-factual regularities, without at least implicitly understanding also what's made explicit by the use of modal concepts that articulate laws. Kant mounts a corresponding line of thought on the side of normative or practical necessity. Normative concepts make explicit commitments that are implicit in the use of any concepts, whether theoretically in judgment or practically in acting intentionally, that is, in endorsing practical maxims. Judgment and agency are implicitly normative phenomena because they consist in the application of concepts, and applying concepts is undertaking commitments and responsibilities whose content is articulated by those concepts. Well, I'm not going to go into how Sellers builds on this thought, because I want to develop it in a slightly different way. Suffice it to say that in the light of Kant's parallel responses to Hume's parallel concerns with the credentials of modal and normative vocabulary, concerns couched in epistemological terms, but at base semantic in character, we can formulate a normative Kant-Sellers thesis by analogy to the modal one. It's the claim that in order to apply or deploy ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, including observational vocabulary, and hence in order to deploy any autonomous vocabulary whatsoever, one must already be able to do everything needed to introduce normative vocabulary. Articulated in terms of meaning-use analysis, It's the claim that there are practices PV necessary for engaging in any autonomous discursive practice that are PP sufficient for practices PV sufficient to deploy normative vocabulary. And if, again by analogy to the modal case, we add the claim that normative vocabulary is VP sufficient to specify those aspects of the practice that are PV necessary for any autonomous discursive practice, then we'll have the full-blown claim that normative vocabulary is elaborated explicitating, or LX, for all autonomous vocabularies. The by now familiar meaning-use diagram for the resultant complex meaning-use relation among vocabularies is the one labeled normative Kant-Sellers thesis on your handout. Well, how might one argue for the normative Kant-Sellers thesis? I've been working all along with the idea that any autonomous set of practices that can be intelligible as deploying a vocabulary, that is, as being discursive or linguistic practices, only insofar as those practices attribute to some performances the pragmatic significance of assertions, and that it's a necessary feature of that pragmatic significance that assertions can both serve as premises and conclusions of inferences. The notions of asserting and inferring are on this account essentially and indissolubly linked. And that's to say that every autonomous discursive practice must include core practices of giving and asking for reasons. It's playing a suitable role in such a constellation of practices that makes the sign designs whose production can have in that context the pragmatic significance of being an assertion, something that can both serve as and stand in need of reasons, qualify as declarative sentences. And standing in those inferential, justificatory, evidential relations is a necessary condition of those sentences being intelligible as expressing propositional contents. It's these core practices of giving and asking for reasons that I propose as being both PV necessary for every autonomous discursive practice, as I've just been claiming, and PP sufficient in the sense of algorithmically elaboratable into practices PV sufficient for the introduction of normative vocabulary, which can then serve explicitly to specify key features of those practices. In particular, I'll argue that no set of practices is recognizable as a game of giving and asking for reasons for assertions unless it involves, implicitly, practically, acknowledging at least two sorts of normative status: commitments and entitlements, and some general structures relating them. Suppose we have a set of counters or markers such that producing or playing one of them has the social significance of making an assertional move in the game. We might decide to call such counters sentences. Then for any player at any time, there must be some way of partitioning sentences into two classes by distinguishing somehow those that he's disposed or otherwise prepared to assert, perhaps when suitably prompted. Those counters, which are distinguished by bearing the player's mark, being on his list, or being kept in his box, constitute his score. By playing a new counter, making an assertion, one alters one's own score and perhaps that of others. Here's my first claim. For such a game or set of toy practices to be recognizable as involving assertions, it must be the case that playing one counter, or otherwise adding it to one's score, can commit one to playing others, or adding them to one's score. If one asserts the swatch is red, one ought to add to one's score also the swatch is colored. Making the one move obliges one to be prepared to make the other as well. This is not to say that all the players actually do have the dispositions they ought to have. One might not act as one is committed or obliged to act. One can break or fail to follow this sort of rule of the game, at least in particular cases, without thereby being expelled from the company of players of the asserting game. Still, I claim, assertional games must have rules of this sort, rules of consequential commitment. Why? Because to be recognizable as assertional, a move must not be idle. It must make a difference. It must have consequences for what else it's appropriate to do, according to the rules of the game. Assertions express judgments or beliefs. Putting a sentence on one's list of judgments, putting it in one's belief box, must have consequences for how else one ought rationally to act, judge, and believe. We may be able to construct cases where it's intelligible to attribute beliefs that are consequentially inert and isolated from their fellows. I say, I just believe cows look goofy, that's all. Nothing follows from that, and I'm not obliged to act in any particular way on that belief. But all of our beliefs could not intelligibly be understood to be like this. If putting sentences onto my list or into my box never has consequences for what else belongs there, then we ought not to understand the list as consisting of my judgments or the box as containing my beliefs. Understanding a claim, the significance of an assertional move, requires understanding at least some of its consequences, knowing what other moves, one would be committing oneself to by making that claim. A parrot, we can imagine, might produce an utterance perceptually indistinguishable from an assertion of, "That's red." Our nonetheless not taking it to have asserted that sentence, not to have made a move in that game, is our taking it that, unaware as it is of the inferential involvements of the claim it would be expressing, of what it would be committing itself to were it to make the claim, the parrot has not thereby succeeded in committing itself to anything. Making that assertion is committing oneself to such consequences as that the swatch is colored, that it's not green, and so on. For this reason, we can understand making a claim as taking up a particular sort of normative stance towards an inferentially articulated content. It's endorsing it, taking responsibility for it, committing oneself to it. The difference between treating something as a claiming and treating it just as a brute sounding off, between treating it as making a move in the assertional game and treating it as an idle performance, is just whether one treats it as the undertaking of a commitment that's suitably articulated by its consequential relations to other commitments. These are rational relations, whereby undertaking one commitment rationally obliges one to undertake others related to it as its inferential consequences. Those relations at least partly articulate the content of the commitment or responsibility that one undertakes by asserting a sentence. Apart from such relations, there is no such content, and hence no assertion. The next claim I want to make is that practices incorporating a game of giving and asking for reasons must involve acknowledgement of a second kind of normative status. I've said that making a move in the assertional game should be understood as acknowledging a certain sort of commitment, articulated by consequential inferential relations, linking the asserted sentence to other sentences. But players of the game of giving and asking for reasons must also distinguish among the commitments an interlocutor undertakes a distinguished subclass to which she is entitled. Linguistic rationalism understands assertions, the fundamental sort of speech act, as essentially things that can both serve as and stand in need of reasons. Giving reasons for a claim is producing other assertions that license or entitle one to it, that justify it. Asking for reasons for a claim is asking for its warrant, for what entitles one to that commitment. Such a practice presupposes a distinction between assertional commitments to which one is entitled and those to which one is not entitled. Reason-giving practices make sense only if there can be an issue as to whether or not practitioners are entitled to their commitments. Indeed, I take it that liability to demands for justification, that is, demonstration of entitlement, is a major dimension of the responsibility that one undertakes, the commitment one makes in asserting something. In making an assertion, one implicitly acknowledges the propriety, at least under some circumstances, of demands for reason, for justification of the claim one has endorsed, the commitment one has undertaken. So besides the committive dimension of assertional practice, there's the critical dimension, the aspect of the practice in which the propriety of those commitments is assessed. Apart from that critical dimension, the notion of reasons gets no grip. So the overall claim is that the sense of endorsement that determines the force of assertional speech acts involves at a minimum a kind of commitment, the speaker's entitlement to which is always potentially at issue. If that's right, then discursive practitioners as such must be able in practice to take or treat each other and themselves as exhibiting normative statuses, as being committed and entitled to contents expressed by the declarative sentences, whose freestanding utterance has the pragmatic significance of acknowledging a commitment and claiming an entitlement. Since by hypothesis those practitioners can already make assertions, the introduction of normative vocabulary permitting one explicitly to say that someone is committed or entitled to a claim requires only the new vocabulary, S is committed to P and S is entitled to P, to be deployed with the circumstances of application that one can assert those sentences formed by using the new normative vocabulary whenever one would in practice respond to S as having the commitment or entitlement labeled with the sentence P, and with the consequences of application that whenever one asserts one of these new normative sentences, one must also take or treat S in practice as having the corresponding commitment or entitlement. Introducing vocabulary playing this role requires only the algorithmic elaborative abilities that I've called response substitution, along with a couple of other basic ones. Well, together with the sort of basic deontic scorekeeping abilities that I've argued one must possess in order to engage in practices of giving and asking for reasons at all. Here you might think of the instructions for introducing conditionals that I offered in my second lecture. Further, when it's used with these circumstances and consequences of application, it's clear that one of these new normative sentences is asserted. The pragmatic significance of the Speech Act will be to say that someone is committed or entitled to a claim, making propositionally explicit a practical attitude, taking or treating someone in practice as committed or entitled to a claim, something that before the advent of the new vocabulary remained implicit in something that one could only do. So my overall claim is that both the modal and the normative Kant-Sellers theses are true. In order to be able to talk at all, to make claims and inferences, one must already know how to do everything necessary in principle, in the precise sense of in principle given by the notion of algorithmic elaboration, to deploy modal and normative vocabulary. And if so, one cannot be stuck in the position Hume took himself to be in, understanding ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, but with that providing no grip on the use of modal or normative vocabulary. The semantic relations between what's expressed by the use of empirical descriptive vocabulary, on the one hand, and what's expressed by the use of modal, and what, something different, is expressed by normative vocabulary, on the other, are essentially pragmatically mediated ones. To understand the relation between how things merely are and how they must be, or, a different matter, ought to be, one must look at what one is doing in saying how things are, and what's required to say what one is thereby doing. Coming to understand both modal and normative vocabulary as standing in the complex resultant pragmatically mediated semantic relation of being LX to, elaborated from and explicating of, practices integral to every autonomous discursive practice, will turn out to be the key to understanding a deep and illuminating feature of the relation between these two vocabularies, not just to vocabulary use in general, but also to each other. It supplies the raw materials for filling out and developing Sellers' suggestive claim that modal vocabulary is a transposed language of norms. In my next lecture, I'll begin to explore the relations between normative and modal vocabulary that become visible to us in this way, showing how normative vocabulary can both serve as a pragmatic metavocabulary for modal vocabulary and as the basis for a directly modal formal semantics for ordinary empirical vocabulary that does not appeal in any way to a notion of truth. In the final lecture, that discussion will be brought together with the discussion of modality and normativity from the two preceding lectures, culminating in an understanding of discursive intentionality, the ultimately semantic relation between knowing subjects and their cognitive objects that's expressed by intentional vocabulary in terms of these pragmatically mediated semantic relations between normative and modal vocabularies. Thank you.
Resume. We have comments from Hugh Price of the University of Sydney.
Thanks, Paul. It's an honor and a great pleasure to be here and to be part of this event. I've been excited by the work that Bob's doing in these lectures for many months now. In fact, to be a little bit more precise, since about 9 p.m. one Friday evening in October the year before last. The occasion was Bob was in Sydney for a couple of weeks, and we had a little one-day conference on sort of Brandonian themes. And we went out to dinner afterwards at a nice little Vietnamese restaurant called the Tan Binh. And we plied Bob with Vietnamese food and Australian beverages. And he started to talk about the work that he'd been doing for the Locke lectures. And at some point, the expressive resources of spoken vocabulary ran out, and he started drawing meaning-use diagrams on the paper tablecloth in the restaurant. And I was sufficiently excited by what I was seeing and hearing that when the meal finished, I had the foresight to realize that the tablecloth had the potential to be a significant relic in the Church of Inferentialism. So I got Bob to autograph it and took it home. And it seemed to me that this was an appropriate occasion to give it what I hope will be the first of many but rather select public viewings. And so if this works, I can now show you the central portion of it. So this is the Tan Binh restaurant. So here it is. I don't know. You see, up in the top left there, there's what's obviously a meaning-use diagram, and the whole thing is authenticated by this commitment entered into on Bob's behalf by signing it in the middle here. And there's a rather more kind of brute causal kind of evidence provided by the traces of Vietnamese food. Okay. Now that was actually the main use of this technology, except I'll also use it later to give you a few quotes from various places in Bob's work. But during Björn Ramberg's talk in the School of Inferentialism preceding this, Björn had a quote from Dick Rorty, which struck me as also having some kind of relevance to both to what I want to talk about today, about what I see as a potential kind of problem or infelicity in Bob's work. But also it's also relevant, as you'll see, to the history of my kind of coming to know about the work. Rorty says, this is a quote from Contingency, Irony and Solidarity, Davidson lets us think of the history of a language as Darwin taught us to think of the history of a coral reef. And as you'll see, one of the things I'm saying in these comments is that I think Bob doesn't stick closely enough to this kind of conception of the project as essentially a biological project. The other connection is to do with the fact that the place where I first read the Locke lectures, when Bob was kind enough to send me a copy a couple of months before he gave them in Oxford, was this place. This is a place called Lord Howe Island, which is about 500 miles off the east coast of Australia in the South Pacific. And as you can see, it's not Prague, but it does have some attractions, including including the coral reefs, particularly the one off the beach in the lower left there. And so for several days, I sort of divided my time between snorkeling on the coral reef in the morning and reading another Locke lecture in the afternoon, and it was a very pleasant holiday. Okay. Now down to the text. Bob begins lecture 4 with this remark. As he actually said it, it was slightly different from this, but as far as I could tell, there were no significant changes, and I won't read through it again because you heard it an hour ago. But what he's doing there is associating Hume's famous challenge to the status of modality with Hume's empiricism rather than his naturalism. And Bob goes on to suggest that the rejection of empiricism's semantic monism, coupled with what he calls the modal Kant-Sellers thesis, clears the way for the modal revolution in philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. And it seems to me that this way of reading the history misses an important ingredient in Hume's treatment of modality, namely Hume's interest in what we might call the project of the genealogy of modality. And this project has the following key features in my view. First, while it may be motivated for Hume by his empiricism, it doesn't depend on that motivation and stands alone as a project for the philosophical understanding of modality, a project in one sense entirely within the scope of a well-motivated philosophical naturalism. Secondly, despite its naturalistic credentials in one sense, It represents a profound challenge to the view of modality reflected in Bob's accurate characterization of the attitude of many contemporary self-styled naturalists. And thirdly, it's a clear precursor of Bob's own project, as described in this lecture, with the result that his project too ought to be seen, in my view, as a powerful challenge to this same form of contemporary naturalism, the kind that sort of takes modality for granted, as it were. Now, what I mean by the genealogy of modality, of course, is the project of understanding how creatures in our situation come to go in for modal talk, how we get in the business of using modal vocabulary and thinking modal thoughts. In Hume, as in Brandom, this is supposed to be a thoroughly naturalistic project, in the sense that it takes for granted that we ourselves are natural creatures without supernatural powers. But the interesting thing is that this naturalistic attitude to modal talk, to the use of modal vocabulary, can easily challenge a naturalistic view of the subject matter, if by this we mean the view that modality itself is part of the furniture of the natural world. And this is an example of how what I've elsewhere called subject naturalism, this is a term that came up again at one point in the school, how subject naturalism can challenge object naturalism. And if this seems puzzling, then think of the normative analogy. The project of a genealogy of normative and evaluative notions is to explain why natural creatures like us go in for using normative concepts and vocabulary. It's naturalistic in the sense that it regards us and our vocabularies as part of the natural order, but not, or at least not necessarily, in the sense that it regards norms and values as part of our natural environment. Many contemporary philosophers seem to find the point much easier to grasp in the normative than the modal case, a fact which no doubt reflects in part the role that modal notions have come to play in the foundations of contemporary philosophy. Hume's expressivist genealogy is a threat to the status of those foundations in a way which may seem to have no parallel in the normative case. And another factor, no doubt, which makes it hard for people to, as it were, see the threat, is the one reflected in Bob's opening remarks about naturalism and modality. Contemporary physics seems modal through and through. But in my view, any naturalist worth her salt ought to be highly skeptical of this kind of appeal to contemporary physics. We can grant that physics as it now stands is irreducibly modal, without simply throwing in the towel on the question as to whether this should be taken as reflecting the way the physical world is independently of us, or a deeply entrenched aspect of the way in which creatures in our situation need to conceptualize the world. Now, of course, these are deep and difficult questions. It isn't immediately clear that there's a standpoint available to us from which to address them. But this difficulty is no excuse for giving up the game, for simply assuming, in effect, that physics, that is, fallible present-day physics, views the world through perfectly transparent lenses. So the point I want to stress is that a plausible naturalistic genealogy for modal discourse, at least a genealogy that didn't rest on the idea that we simply have an ability to track modal facts, would count heavily on one side of these issues. In effect, it would tell us why creatures in our situation would be led to develop a modal physics, even if they inhabited a non-modal world, a Hume world, as contemporary metaphysicians sometimes say. As I've said, such a genealogy would be naturalistic in the Humean sense, which puts the emphasis on the idea that we humans and our thought and talk are part of the natural order. But many mainstream contemporary philosophers keen to think of themselves as natural would be discomforted by it. Why? Because it challenges the idea that the function of modal vocabulary is to keep track of the distinctively modal features of the natural world, and challenges the project of resting various parts of realistic metaphysics on modal foundations. Thus, I think that Bob's presentation of his own genealogical project in this lecture obscures both some enemies and some allies. Its enemies, as I've already said, are the people in contemporary philosophy who assume a more robust metaphysical approach to modality. There isn't an easy accommodation between Bob's project on the one side and naturalism as commonly metaphysically conceived on the other. And the tension is one of the most important in contemporary philosophy, for the reasons Bob himself puts his finger on, the role of modality in the revolution that swept through analytic philosophy in the last third of the 20th century. Bob thus has a much bigger fight on his hands than his presentation here would suggest, in my view. But he's on the side of what I think of as Humean virtue, and he should be leading the charge, leading the pragmatist campaign against modal metaphysics. And the best reason for optimism about the outcome of the campaign is that we pragmatists hold the naturalistic high ground and can't be dislodged, at least not without dislodging Darwin, because he's the rock upon which we stand. So the idea is that the second-order naturalistic reflection on the origin of our vocabularies always trumps, in principle, the unreflected first-order intuitions which merely exercise those vocabularies. As for Bob's allies, of course, these are Hume and his expressivist descendants, fellow travellers in the quest for what's perhaps best called a pragmatist genealogy for modality. Here are some examples concerning a rather mixed bag of modal notions. Ramsay and other subjectivists about probability. Ramsay again about causation and laws. The Russell of 1913 on the relation of causation to physics, who, although perhaps in contemporary terms more of an eliminativist than a true pragmatist, identified some of the key moves on which a modern causal pragmatist ought to rely. Ryle, whom Bob does mention about laws and conditionals. Arguably Wittgenstein, depending on how one interprets him. The whole tradition of understanding causation in terms of manipulation, here I'm thinking of people like Collingwood, von Richt, Gasking, and so on. Interestingly, I know 3 people in that tradition who are all students of Wittgenstein. And Simon Blackburn, who's perhaps done more than anyone else in recent years to defend the case for a kind of modest Humean expressivism, among other things stressing the parallel between the moral and the modal cases. Common to all these writers is a concern to explain one or other of the modal notions in terms of what we do with them, what practical role they play in our lives, rather than in metaphysical terms. And this brings me to the general issue I want to raise in the remainder of these comments, namely what I see as Bob's somewhat ambiguous attitude to ontology and metaphysics. Pragmatists in general haven't been shy about expressing some antipathy to metaphysics. Here too, of course, Hume is a shining example with his famous remarks about committing volumes of stuff to the flames. And one thinks too about Ryle's remark that being a professor of metaphysics was like being a professor of tropical diseases. In both cases, Ryle said the aim was to eradicate the subject matter, not to promote it. But we don't find this kind of anti-metaphysical attitude in Bob's work. Rather, we find what looks to me to be a degree of ambiguity or uncertainty about the goals of his project with respect to what are traditionally seen as metaphysical and ontological questions. I think that Bob hasn't seen clearly the importance of a distinction which is marked relatively clearly in what I'm regarding as the Humean expressivist tradition between 2 views of the philosopher's project. And in the remainder of the talk, I want to say something about this distinction and offer some textual evidence from Bob's work that he hasn't properly faced up to the need to take a stand on it, on one side or the other. And of course, I recommend the Humean side. Okay, so this is a section called Humean Expressivism, Biology, Not Ontology. Expressivist views, in what I'm taking to be the Humean sense, are often responses to what are now sometimes called location or placement problems. Initially, these present as ontological or perhaps epistemological problems within the context of some broad metaphysical or epistemological program, empiricism, say, or physicalism, and Bob's already talked about this kind of motivation for semantic analysis. By the lights of the program in question, some of the things we talk about seem hard to place within the framework the program dictates for reality or our knowledge of reality. Where are moral facts to be located in the kind of world described by physics, or where is our knowledge of causal necessity to go if a posteriori knowledge is to be grounded on the senses? The expressivist solution is to move the problem cases outside the scope of the general program in question by arguing that our tendency to place them within its scope reflects a mistaken understanding of the vocabulary associated with the matters in question. Thus, the apparent location problem for moral or causal facts was said to rest on a mistaken understanding of the function of moral or causal language. Once we note that this language is not in the business of describing reality, as people say, says the expressivist, the location problem can be seen to rest on a category mistake. And it's important to note that traditional expressivism, in this form thus involves both a negative and a positive thesis about the vocabularies in question. The negative thesis was that these vocabularies are not genuinely representational, and traditional expressivists here took for granted that some parts of language are genuinely representational, and implicitly that this was a substantial theoretical matter of some kind. As many people have pointed out, the first I know, I think, is John McDowell, this thesis is undermined by deflationism about the semantic notions on which it rests. Less commonly noted is the fact that deflationism leaves entirely intact the expressivist positive thesis, which proposes some alternative expressive account of the function of each vocabulary in question. As I've argued elsewhere, this kind of positive thesis not only survives deflation of the negative thesis by semantic minimalism, it actually wins by default in the sense that semantic deflationism requires some non-representational account of the functions of the language in question. In other words, it ensures that whatever positive work we're going to indulge in theorizing about the role and functions of the vocabularies in question, it has to be conducted in non-semantic or non-referential terms. Okay, but what's happening at this point on the metaphysical side to those ontological issues that expressivism originally sought to evade? Note first that traditional expressivism tended to be an explicitly anti-realist position, at least in those versions embedded in some broader metaphysical program. In ethics, for example, non-cognitivism was seen as a way of making sense of the language of morals, while denying that there's really any such thing as moral values or moral facts. But this was always a little problematic. If moral language was non-descriptive, how could it be used to make even a negative ontological claim? Better perhaps to say that the traditional metaphysical issue of realism versus anti-realism is simply ill-posed, an attitude to metaphysics that's long been in play, as Carnap makes clear here in this quote from Empiricism, Semantics and Ontology. Carnap says, influenced by the ideas of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Vienna Circle rejected both the thesis of the reality of the external world and the thesis of its irreality as pseudo-statements. The same was the case both for the thesis of the reality of universals and the nominalistic thesis that they are not real and that their alleged names are not names of anything. And famously, Carnap in that paper recommends this kind of metaphysical quietism quite generally, and this is surely a desirable stance for an expressivist, especially when semantic minimalism deflates what I call the expressivist negative thesis. An expressivist wants to allow that as users of moral language, we may talk of the existence of values and moral facts in what Carnap would call an internal sense. What's important is to deny that there's any other sense in which these issues make sense. And here Carnap is a very valuable ally. So construed, expressivism simply deflates the traditional ontological questions. It sets them aside, aiming to cure us of the urge to ask them, as Wittgenstein or Ryle might put it. In their place, it offers us questions about the role and genealogy of vocabularies. And these are questions about human behavior, broadly construed, rather than questions about some seemingly puzzling part of the metaphysical realm. So expressivism isn't a way of doing metaphysics in a pragmatist key, it's a way of doing something like anthropology, by which I mean a small but interesting subspecialty of biology. Hence my Humean slogan, biology, not ontology. Okay, so the next question I want to raise is where Bob stands with respect to this distinction between ontology and biology. My impression, as I said at the beginning, is that he sometimes tries to straddle the divide, or at least doesn't sufficiently distinguish the two projects. Now, this is, of course, a very large topic, deserving a much more detailed treatment than I can give it here, but I want to just sketch some reasons in support of this assessment. On the one hand, as I've already noted, Bob often writes as if his project is metaphysical in the present sense, as if he's concerned to give us an account of the nature and constitution of particular items of philosophical interest, such as conceptual content and the representational properties of language. So here's a quote from Making It Explicit, where Bob says, the primary treatment of the representational dimension of conceptual content is reserved for chapter 8, where the representational properties of semantic contents are explained as consequences of the essentially social character of inferential practice. And what I want to call attention to here, you'll see that I'm using, the italics are Bob's emphasis and the bits in red are my emphasis. So I'm calling attention to the fact that in this passage, he's using the term representational property, so at least on the face of it, at the first glance, it looks like a kind of metaphysical or ontological stance. It's concerned with the nature of properties, after all. And at a more general level, another quote from Making It Explicit, Bob says, the investigation of the nature and limits of the explicit expression in principles of what is implicit in discursive practices yields a powerful transcendental argument, a transcendental expressive argument for the existence of objects. And if that doesn't sound like metaphysics, then what does? But on the other hand, Bob often makes it clear that what's really going on is about forms of language and thought, not about extra-linguistic activity as such. So the passage I just gave you continues with the following gloss on the transcendental argument in question. It's an argument that and why the only form of the world we can talk and think of can take is that of a world of facts about particular objects and their properties and relation. And similarly, at a less general level, Bob often stresses that what he's offering is primarily an account of the attribution of terms like truth and reference and represents and so on, not of the properties or relations that other approaches take those terms to denote. Concerning his account of knowledge claims, for example, he says, its primary focus is not on knowing itself, but on attributions of knowledge, attitudes towards that status. The pragmatist must ask, what are we doing when we say that someone knows something? But then a few sentences later, continuing the same exposition, we have this. A pragmatist, phenomenalist account of knowledge will accordingly investigate the social and normative significance of acts of attributing knowledge. And here the two stances are once again run together. To make things clear, a pragmatist should deny that he's offering an account of knowledge at all. That's what it means to say that the project is biology, not ontology. Now, another point in Bob's favour from my Humean expressivist perspective is that he often makes it clear that he rejects a realist construal of reference relations, thus concerning the consequences of his preferred anaphoric version of semantic deflationism. He writes, one who endorses the anaphoric account of what's expressed by true and refers must accordingly eschew the reifying move to a truth property and a reference relation. A line is implicitly drawn by this approach between ordinary truth and reference talk and various specifically philosophical extensions of it based on theoretical conclusions that have been drawn from a mistaken understanding of what such talk expresses. Ordinary remarks about what's true and what's false and about what some expression refers to are perfectly in order as they stand, and the anaphoric account explains how they should be understood. But truth and reference are philosophers' fictions generated by grammatical misunderstandings. And then a little further on in Making Explicit, we have this passage, various word-world relations play important explanatory roles in theoretical semantic projects, but to think of any one of these as what is referred to as the reference relation is to be bewitched by surface syntactic form. Okay, and of course I agree absolutely with the sorts of things that Bob says in these passages, particularly the latter one. On the other hand, Bob's strategy at this point suggests that in some ways he's still wedded to a traditional representationalist picture. Consider in particular his reliance on syntactic criteria in order to be able to deny, as he puts it, that claims expressed using traditional semantic vocabulary make it possible for us to state specifically semantic facts in the way that claims expressed using the vocabulary of physics, say, make it possible for us to state specifically physical facts. And here, to my ears, my sort of Humean ears, as it were, Bob sounds like a traditional local kind of expressivist who's still in the grip of the picture that some parts of language are genuinely descriptive or representational in some robust sense. And he hasn't seen the option and attractions of allowing one's semantic deflationism to deflate this picture too. And so he remains vulnerable to the slide to ontology wherever the syntactical loophole isn't available. And I think this reading is borne out by the fact that at certain points he makes to confront these traditional metaphysical issues head on. This is now from the 2000 book, Articulating Reasons. He says, none of these is a naturalistic account, referring to various aspects of his account of the referential, objective, and normative aspects of discourse. And again, going back to making it explicit, norms are not objects in the causal order. Nonetheless, according to the account presented here, there are norms, and their existence is neither supernatural nor mysterious. Now, once again, this passage continues with what's, by my lights, exactly the right explanation of what keeps Bob's feet on the ground. He says, normative statuses are domesticated by being understood in terms of normative attitudes, which are in the causal order. But my point is that he shouldn't have had to retreat in this way in the first place. His account only looks non-naturalistic because he tries to conceive of it as metaphysics or ontology. If he'd stayed on the virtuous anthropological or biological side of the fence, there would have been no appearance of anything non-naturalistic and no need to retreat. Rejecting the traditional naturalist, non-naturalist debate is pretty much of a piece with rejecting the traditional realist, anti-realist debate. Okay, well, I've got one final example which seems to me to illustrate Bob's continuing attraction to what I'm thinking of as the more representationalist side of the fence where the project of reconstructing representational relations using, the side where we find the project of reconstructing representational relations using pragmatic raw materials. And it's from, if Bob will forgive me for looking ahead 2 lectures, it's from the closing lecture of this series. And it's a characterization he offers of his own project in response to the following self-posed challenge. The challenge is, doesn't the story I've been telling remain too resolutely on the word side of the word-world divide? And his response to this is, engaging in discursive practices and exercising discursive abilities is using words to say and mean something, hence to talk about items in the world. Those practices, the exercise of those abilities, those uses, establish semantic relations between words and the world. This is one of the big ideas that traditional pragmatism brings to philosophical thought about semantics. Don't look to begin with to the relation between representings and represented, but to the nature of the doing of the process that institutes that relation. I've been arguing that the right course, and the course that Bob actually often follows in practice, is precisely to remain resolutely on the word side of the word-world divide, as he puts it. This resolution doesn't prevent us from seeking an explanation, from seeking to explain referential vocabulary, the ordinary ascriptions of semantic relations, whose pervasiveness in language no doubt does much to explain the attractiveness of the representational picture. And nor does it require, absurdly, that we say nothing about word-world relations at all. On the contrary, as Bob himself points out in the passage I quoted earlier, various word-world relations play important explanatory roles in theoretical semantic projects, theoretical anthropological projects too, I want to stress. But to think of any of these as what is referred to as the reference relation is to be bewitched by surface syntactic form. So biological anthropologists will have plenty to say about the role of the natural environment in the genealogy and functions of vocabularies. But the trap they need to avoid is that of speaking of, again to quote Bob, semantic relations between words and the world in anything other than a deflationary tone. For once semantic relations become part of the biologist's substantial theoretical ontology, so too do their relata at both ends of the relation. Biology thus becomes committed not merely to the words, but to all the things to which it now takes those words to stand in semantic relations, to norms, values, numbers, causes, conditional facts, and so on. In fact, to all the entities which gave rise to placement problems in the first place. At this point, expressivism's hard-won gains have been thrown away, and the subject has become infected once more with the virus of metaphysics. That's why it's crucial that biological anthropologists should remain semantic deflationists, in my view, and not try to recover substantial semantic relations, even on pragmatic foundations. Okay, well, in calling this kind of, the possibility of this kind of liberation from metaphysics an insight of Humean expressivism, I don't mean, of course, to belittle the respects in which pragmatism has moved on from Hume. Bob himself notes that Sellers characterized his own philosophical project as that of moving analytic philosophy from its Humean phase to a Kantian phase, and glosses the heart of this idea as the view that traditional empiricism missed the importance of the conceptual articulation of thought. And Rorty, in turn, has described Bob's project as a contribution to the next step, a transition from a Kantian to an Hegelian phase based on recognition of the social constitution of concepts and of the linguistic norms on which they depend. For my part, I've urged merely that Brandam's version of this project is in need of clarity on what I think it's fair to describe as a Humean insight. Humean expressivism may be a large step behind Kant in failing to appreciate the importance of the conceptual, and a further large step behind Hegel in failing to see that the conceptual depends on the social, but it's still at the head of the field for its understanding of the way in which what we'd now call pragmatism simply turns its back on metaphysics. Okay, well, that's basically it. Just to sum up, give you a sense of what I think the message is supposed to be. In real life, Bob is a much more carnivorous kind of guy than me. I mean, at the Tan Bin restaurant where this all started, my guess is that he probably had something like the stewed pork belly with quail eggs, and I probably had something like the green papaya salad. But when it comes to our attitudes as pragmatists to metaphysical ontology, I find these roles strangely reversed. I want to follow Hume, Ramsey, Ryle, Wittgenstein, Blackburn, and others in cauterizing, deflating, or otherwise sanitizing large parts of the discipline. Whereas Bob seems, from my point of view, distressingly vegetarian, with no taste for this particular hunt. And nowhere is this difference more obvious, I think, than in the case of modality. In my view, modality is the soft underbelly of contemporary metaphysics. It's the belly of the subject because, as Bob himself notes in this lecture, so much of what now passes from metaphysics either rests on it or is nourished by it or passes through it. And it's soft because it's vulnerable to attack from precisely the direction to which the subject itself is most keen to be most receptive, namely naturalism. And what I want to urge is that Bob's treatment of modality in this lecture provides precisely the tools required to press this advantage, precisely the kind of sharp implements we need to turn the guts of modern metaphysics into mincemeat and sausages. Okay. I'd actually hoped to, in the original version of this talk, I was going to end there. I thought it was particularly appropriate to end a talk in Prague with the word sausages. But then during the school in the last few days, I realized that in the interest of clarity, there's a sort of complication that I ought to add, so there's one more paragraph. Actually, the story is a little bit more complicated than this, because modern metaphysics turns out to have two underbellies, both of them soft, a fact which underlines what a strange and vulnerable beast it is, in my view. The second underbelly is representationalism. In other words, the fact that much of contemporary metaphysics is built on appeals to reference and other robust semantic notions. Here too, as I've said, I read Bob as a somewhat ambiguous ally of the traditional pragmatist attack. On the one hand, he offers us profound new insights into how to do philosophy in another key. On the other hand, as the remark I quoted from Lecture 6 indicates, he sometimes seems to want to get out of it some pragmatist substitute for Platonic representation, some surgery that would reconstruct the semantic belly of the beast, as it were, in new and healthy form. And I particularly liked John McDowell's Frankensteinian metaphor, when I'd already written this. And once again, I just want to urge that that's simply the wrong move. The two-bellied beast should be put out of its misery, and no one's better placed than Bob to do the job. Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
I don't know whether they're going to do it, but I asked them to try and keep the lights off so it wouldn't be so obvious as I was squirming here.
Would you like to have the lights on?
No. Well, there we go. Well, you know, I think this is a very difficult issue, and Hugh and I have been trying to hammer this out. This is an episode of that. Rorty and I have been trying to hammer this out. John McDowell and I have. We all have deflationary impulses, and everyone except Hugh and Rorty has some kind of realistic impulses too. They just think that we should get over all of these attempts to speak with the vulgar and the tradition. And we in the middle are stuck, torn both ways. I actually find metaphysics left in claims like we should just stay on the word side of the word-world divide. I think that sort of recoil is already is betraying that one hasn't sufficiently freed oneself from the traditional way of thinking. It's moving from a one-sided objectivism to a one-sided subjectivism. But that's not to say that I feel that I know exactly how one should be in the middle. Here's the sort of thing that I mean by not being maybe sufficiently freed from the old ways of thinking. Hugh, I think, in a statement like, in effect, it would tell us why creatures in our situation would be led to develop a modal physics even if they inhabited a non-modal world. Well, I don't understand what a non-modal world could conceivably mean. That counterfactual, what if we inhabited a non-modal world? If the expressive resources of modality are really part of the very meanings of the words that we use to describe the world, and that this is not an optional feature, as though, well, if we just had 3 eyes instead of 2, we wouldn't have that. No, the very idea of talking involves this modal articulation. Well, now Hugh wants to say, well, that's a fact about talking, not a fact about the world. And I don't understand the game that we're playing in assigning some features of what our only understanding of things could be, assigning responsibility of that to us, and saying, oh, well, that's because of something about our conceptual activity, our talk, not some feature of the world. That enterprise that Kant certainly encouraged, whether in the end he ought to be understood as practicing it himself, that enterprise of trying to assign responsibility for some of these features to one side or the other of a word-world divide, I don't understand. One place where this comes out, Hugh says, gee, you seem to believe that there is some genuinely descriptive vocabulary, where that involves representing how things are. Well, yes, I do. I think describing is something we do. Well, Hugh thinks that too. But I think that it is right, not just in our ordinary talk, but even in our philosophical talk, to say that part of describing is representing how things are. Now, Sellers says, science is the measure of all things, of those that are, that they are, of those that are not, that they are not, in the descriptive and explanatory realm. Not everything that we do with the language is describing. He says also that the descriptive and explanatory resources of the language advance hand in hand. And that's one of the thoughts that I've been developing in the lecture that we just heard. The explanatory resources are the ones that take explicitly modal form. Those are the ones that tell us how facts that we can represent stand in explanatory relations to one another, and how the very idea of a fact, of a way the world could be, is unintelligible apart from the notion of explanatory connections, modal, that we make explicit with modality, between those facts. Well, the job of those modal expressions is not to describe something. So if by a non-modal world we mean one where one doesn't use modal resources to describe features of the world, then I guess we do live in a non-modal world. And when I say, well, but it's still one that we can only be aware of, describe, or understand in modal terms, Hugh's going to say, yeah, well, that's true, but don't think of those modal features as features of the world. Well, if they're necessarily features of our talk about the world, if our talk about the world necessarily is modally articulated, I don't really understand the point of saying there's no objective feature of the world that corresponds to these things. If what we're saying is their job is not to describe, they have a different job than the descriptive vocabulary, in particular because they're articulating these explanatory relations between them, well, I understand that. I don't know what to say at this point. I don't know how to talk about what to assign responsibility for to the world and what to assign responsibility to us. I don't know how to play that game. And I'm trying not to play that game. Well, that's, on the one hand, wriggling and not taking sides on the opposition Hugh offers. On the other hand, I think of it as trying to get beyond the framework that looks as though you need to come down on the word side or the world side. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do, no doubt clumsily in the sixth lecture, will be give us some way of talking that gets outside of having to take a one-sided, come down in a one-sided way. The question then is exactly what's involved, what's required, what's the best way to turn one's back on metaphysics. Hugh wants to do that. I want to do that too. But I think that assigning responsibility for some feature of our discursive practice, either to us or to the world, is doing metaphysics. It's just doing it in a subjectivist way rather than in an objectivist way. But that's not to say that I know how to talk about these things. Yeah. Hugh thinks that doing anthropology is doing a kind of biology. I don't understand that. I think social sciences are sciences too. They're not reducible to natural sciences, even to biology. And that the last thing you want to do is be biological in the kind of anthropology you're doing if it's discursive practice that you're talking about. Discursive practice is essentially a social practice. Biology gets to the verge of the social in things like population biology, but when it does, it's not getting to the social in the normative sense that we need to talk about discursive practice. So I actually find that an unnecessarily reductive form of naturalism, even if you're biological on the subject side rather than on the object side. Now, one last maybe confession about, form of the confession about sort of not knowing how to talk in this area, responsible for the wavering that he's seeing. He says, if semantic relations, any kind of sanitized reconstruction of the representational dimension of language, which is not just an account of how these words are used in ordinary talk, but in our philosophical talk, about talk, to acknowledge a representational dimension. This is what he's trying to talk me out of. He says, we become, once semantic relations become part of, well, forget that it's the biologist, our substantial theoretical semantics, so do their relata at both ends of the relation. And we become committed not just to words, but to all the things which it takes those words to stand in semantic relations to numbers, values, causes, conditional facts, and so on. Yeah, I think there are numbers. I think there are norms. I do think that adopting representational talk towards basically declarative sentences commits you to the existence of facts corresponding to them and of the objects the facts are about. But a fact for me is just as for Frege, is just a claim that is true. And if there are true normative claims, then there are normative facts. If there are true modal claims, then there are modal facts. What I don't have is a metaphysical account of the nature of facts in general, for instance, that requires them to be built up in Tinkertoy fashion as spatial arrangements of objects or something like that, which is going to make you puzzle about, well, what kind of a thing could a modal fact or a probabilistic fact or a normative fact be? I want to say I'm using fact in a much more deflated sense than Hugh is when he's worried about our being committed to these things. When I say that there are numbers, I'm saying that some arithmetical claims are true and that numerals function as proper singular terms. That's all I'm saying. I think that's what Frege taught us, how Frege taught us to think about the question of whether there's a certain kind of object. It just is the question of whether a certain kind of expression functions as a singular term. Hugh wants us to say, stop talking when you say it functions as a singular term. That's okay, that's good pragmatist anthropology. Don't go on to say, and because some of these claims are true, now understood in a properly deflationist sense, that means that there are arithmetic facts and these numerical objects. But I don't see why not to say that in the suitably deflated sense. These claims are true. A fact is a claim that is true, a claimable that is true. There doesn't have to be an actual claiming of it. Now, what I'm not sure about is I'm not confident that the various remarks I've made about how to turn one's back on metaphysics and have a relaxed view about the representational dimension of language, that this all actually hangs together and is coherent. That is, I do feel the tension that Hugh is diagnosing, but it doesn't seem to me, at any rate, necessary to go all the way over to all this stuff is happening on the side of the words, and what, we have a non-Humean world, or a world that's what? I don't know what's on the object side if I stop thinking about all of these facts and objects. So that's probably just a complicated confession of confusion, but those are the things I know how to say.
Thank you, Bob. Could people who want to ask questions, it's very bright up here and dim down there, could you wave rather vigorously, otherwise I'm not going to see you. Yes, at the front, yes, you. And then in the orange at the back.
Yes, on this metaphysics issue, it strikes me that, it struck me while I was listening to Hugh that biology versus ontology is a false dichotomy, and isn't it open to Bob to say that he's doing logic in some sense? So when Bob is talking about representational representative properties or giving an expressive argument for the existence of objects. Couldn't this be part of logic? And Kant taught that logic is prior to ontology, and perhaps Bob is following Kant in that way. And that for Hugh to say that when for Bob to talk about representative properties at all is necessarily doing metaphysics, isn't that taking for granted an ontologically inflected way of seeing philosophy?
Okay, thanks, Kathy. On the first point, I mean, I think that one could only read Bob as it were, just doing logic, given a kind of a stretching of the boundaries of logic, which would be so extreme that it wouldn't really make any difference to the terms of the debate, because it would be just using the name for the project of what I'm calling the sort of genealogy of vocabularies, modal vocabulary or whatever. I mean, I take it that one thing Bob and I certainly have in common is we're interested in that genealogical project, and we're interested in doing it kind of within the framework of the naturalistic understanding of ourselves that we take for granted after Darwin. Secondly, I mean, I think my worry that putting too much representationalism back into the story at the end, in the way I see Bob as wanting to do, leads you back into metaphysics, takes a rather precise form, the form that I spelled out and that Bob referred to, in terms of the idea that if the semantic relations becomes that part of your substantial theoretical vocabulary, even if only in a derivative sense derived from something more basic, such as sort of pragmatic facts of one kind or another, then you get the relata too, and you thus get the ontology. Now Bob, in his comments, responded to that by saying something like, well, look, I mean, he wants to use this very deflated notion of a fact so that the facts just track the claims we take to be true or something of that kind. Now, I'm perfectly happy, and because I'm a deflationist, I'm trying to be more of a deflationist than Bob all the time, so I'm perfectly happy with that sort of deflated notion of fact. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that, I mean, if we think of the world as just as it were, the sum of I mean, as it were, the world from our point of view of being just the sum of the true claims we make in all our different vocabularies. We need to draw a distinction between, as it were, that world and the world we're talking about when we engage within a particular vocabulary, namely the vocabulary of biology or anthropology, in a particular task, namely the task of trying to give a naturalistic genealogy of all our other vocabularies. Well, no, I shouldn't say all our others, because I want the thing to be reflexive. I want us to see part of the project as giving a genealogy for the scientific vocabulary too. So I think what I want to say to Bob is that on the one hand, I'm happy with the deflationary use of the notion of fact, world, and so on. But I don't think that gets him off the hook, because I think that there's a more precise notion of world, which is, as it were, something like what you see when you're just doing science. And I mean, given that that's the project which I see us as both engaged in some sense, that sort of biological, anthropological project, that distinction is still significant.
Well, Hugh, this is where you make me nervous. You want to say, look, if it's all very well and good to say that there are numbers and that there are norms and that there are conditional facts, the fact that if something is copper, it'll conduct electricity. It's all very well to say that, as it were, when you're talking in these discourses. But when we get serious as philosophers and want to talk about our discursive practices, we've got to do that in the language of natural science. That's the kind of subject naturalist that you are. And when we're doing that, you'd better not be invoking things like norms that we're in contact with or numbers that we're thinking about or anything like that. That seems to me of falling back into a bad sort of reductive naturalism on the side of subjects that's just as bad as reductive naturalism on the side of objects. I don't see why we shouldn't be allowed to invoke the kinds of facts that there are in explaining what we do. It may be that we have particular explanatory projects where we say, well, I'm interested in the relation between the biological vocabulary and the normative vocabulary, and then it's going to be methodologically precluded that I sort of use the normative vocabulary at certain points. But it seems like you think, well, what there really is what's described by the language of biology and us as organisms in that, and then we come to engage in these discursive practices and somehow project all of these second-class things, which, yeah, if you want in a deflated sense to say they're there because we talk about them, okay, but they're not really there. What's really there is the biology and the atoms and the void. And that makes me nervous.
Sorry, Hugh. Is that Mark? Yeah.
I want to go back to the counterfactuals. Seems to me that there's at least two kinds of material inferential moves, the kind that are made explicit by counterfactuals and the kinds that are made explicit by indicatives. These are different. And there's correspondingly different incompatibility relations, right? In one sense, you might say counterfactually, Oswald didn't kill Kennedy is counterfactually incompatible with Johnson was legally inaugurated as president, because if he hadn't, then Kennedy would still be there and he'd be the president and you can't put a second one in. But it's indicatively consistent with it, because if he didn't, then somebody else did, because we know he's dead. And okay, now I think you might want to just say yes about that, but what I worry is that, you know, it just makes the project a little more complicated, because I don't think you can sort of, as it were, give the account of explicitating the one and wait around and then give the account of explicitating the other, because this robustness that you talk about, if we're going to employ either one of these, it seems to me we have to understand its robustness across two dimensions. Both, say, take a counterfactual, we have to understand its counterfactual robustness. We have to understand, well, you know, if R were the case, if P were the case, then Q would be the case is no longer the case. And we also have to understand, as it were, evidential robustness. What claims are would be evidence that, though we now think if P were the case, Q would be the case, it's not. And for familiar examples, they're not the same, which means that in the language making this, that makes this explicit in the end, you need to be able to nest these arbitrarily within one another. You know, if R is evidence that if P were the case, then Q wouldn't be evidence for Z or whatever, or losing the letters. And so I worry that it's even possible to give a meta-vocabulary of incompatibility and some kind of material implication and robustness that doesn't develop both sets of books at the same time.
Okay, well, of course, you're opening up a vastly complicated area, and all I can do is indicate the direction of approach that I would have. I think that the difference between the subjunctive and the indicative conditionals, that is the difference in what's made explicit by them, it is captured by thinking about differences in what you're holding fixed in the collateral hypotheses, the auxiliary hypotheses that you've got. So as you indicate, when we're reasoning indicatively and would say, if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did, because he is dead, he was shot, that's indicating that we're holding that bit fixed in making that collateral commitment fixed as we're extracting consequences, when if we're trying to assess the more subjunctive conditional, if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, somebody else would have. We're not holding fixed as a collateral premise the fact that he was held fixed. Now, that's the basic phenomenon that sort of anybody thinking about these different kinds of conditionals is acknowledging, and the question just is how to get that into the apparatus. My way of thinking about that is to think of the material inferences as non-monotonic, and so as relative to an environment of collateral premises. And then we're going to see sort of all sorts of different inferences that could be made if you hold just this much fixed and vary the rest. There isn't some bright line between the indicative and the subjunctive ones. There's just all sorts of differences that these collateral premises make. So my project in the vicinity is to have a general account of that, of sensitivity to different ones. But that's a huge promissory note that I'm not actually in a position to cash. That is, that's a commitment to being able to reconstruct subjunctive conditionals in Lewis's sense as expressive of one range of this thing. The necessarily true ordinary conditionals that he argues are different from those in another sense, are ordinary indicative conditionals and so on, by varying parameters in this apparatus. That's what I'm committed to being able to do. I haven't done that. So, you know, that's an open promissory note, one that I don't have the cash for in my back pocket.
Thank you. I think Michael Kramer back there had a question.
This is a bit more on what you have to say about modality. I suppose I should wait for lecture 5 for all the details, but I'm a bit puzzled about what the strategy is supposed to be. You quote Ryle early on, approvingly, when Ryle says that in order to deny a counterfactual conditional, we would have to show that it's possible that the antecedent is true and the consequence false. And you come back to that later saying that Ryle's remarks suggest a strategy, which is to treat if P were true, Q would be true, as equivalent to it's not possible that P and not Q. Now that looks like it's equating the counterfactual with strict implication, and I thought it was part of the lesson of David Lewis as against C.I. Lewis that that's not correct. I mean, that gives the wrong sorts of results. Now what you go on to say is you try to follow this strategy by treating the claim that Q follows from P as equivalent to a claim about incompatibility relations, which has something to do perhaps with the possibility of something and not something. But I'm not exactly clear how if you are following Ryle's strategy, why don't you get the undesirable result that counterfactuals are just strict implication? And if you don't get that result, then how are you following Ryle's strategy?
Okay, fair enough. I'm actually not following Ryle's strategy in those details. The incompatibility is supposed to get us ranges of counterfactual robustness, and that's supposed to get us real subjunctive conditionals. What I wanted from Ryle was the conceptual connection between inference and modality, and I shouldn't have suggested that I was following him in the level of detail that that principle says. You know, I shouldn't claim to be following him in endorsing the principle that the way you deny a counterfactually robust conditional is, in effect, to deny the corresponding strict implication. That's something I take it we've learned he was wrong about. But I think he was right about the fundamental claim that there's a conceptual connection between modal talk and conditionals codifying inferences. So I should have made that claim more modestly.
Jim Conant.
This is about the exchange between you and Hugh, the main topic, and Hugh's finding attention in your work, especially making it explicit. And I thought I'd propose a sort of diagnosis of what at least gives the appearance of the tension for Bob to comment on as whether it's attention, and for Hugh to comment on as whether it's a correct diagnosis. And the way I'd put it is a kind of tension between at least a strain of rhetoric, and maybe more than that, which sounds what Hugh's calling a sort of Darwinian naturalistic genealogical note, and the sort of Kantian Phrygian theme that you were sounding in your answer to Hugh, and a question about how those two moments fit together and making it explicit, because I think it's those two moments that are at least generating the appearance of attention. So with respect to the latter in your response, you were saying, look, Kant's taught us that in order to be able to describe things at all, we've got to have control in our concepts. In order to have control in our concepts, we have to be able to think modally about their application. So modality is a condition of description. So why shouldn't we take modality as seriously as we take the concepts that we use even for first-order empirical description? Similarly for Frege. Frege's taught us, that, what it is to be able to refer to something and therefore to have it figure as a possible object of thought is for it to be, the target of reference of a singular term. But if we look at how singular terms behave, then there's no reason not to count numbers as, referred to by such terms, therefore, as objects, therefore, why can't we say there are numbers, and so forth. So for a lot of things that, if I understand Hugh correctly, sound to him like very metaphysical things to say about there being norms, numbers, modalities, you're saying, look, there's a form of philosophical approach that you're inheriting from Kant and Hume, a Kant and Frege, in which what we've discovered is if we find our way around our own forms of thinking and we see these are all aspects of the conditions of the possibility of those forms, we have to actually take them seriously. We can't then sort of keep our finger on the piece while we're moving and say we don't really mean to be making the move. If we're going to make these kinds of moves in our discursive practices, we've got to let go of the pieces that we use to make those moves and commit ourselves to those aspects of the practice as well. So that's the response. But then I take it the strain in making explicit that makes Hugh want to enlist you as his ally is the kind of, for instance, framing description of the strategy as one in which we're engaged in a kind of reductive semantics, in which we're baking a semantic and intentional cake out of ingredients that are not so parsimonious as a certain kind of physicalist would permit himself, but nonetheless merely normative ingredients, where the suggestion is something mysterious about the semantic and the intentional. And if we tell a certain kind of story about using these ingredients out of which we're baking the cake that appear to be less than semantic and intentional, we will make the mystery go away. And that seems to suggest something like, well, there's a base vocabulary that's more respectable by some lights. And then I think Hugh has a picture of why that's more respectable base vocabulary to use, in which we're not allowing ourselves these thicker notions. And we vindicate our entitlement to those thicker notions, not because they're immanent to our forms of thinking in the way that this Kant-Frege tradition suggested, but because it turns out, given this privileged vocabulary, which is though not that of first-order physics, it should be said. So I think the biology-sociology split is still there. But still, from some other standpoint, a base vocabulary that we're seeing as, and now one might say something like metaphysically privileged in some way, it's because we can engage in that reduction that we've vindicated our entitlement. That seems to be a very different strategy for vindicating your entitlement to certain forms of expression. And then it seems to me there's different answers open to you. One answer is to say, well, yes, I am interested in the possibility of that kind of, using your word now projecting it back into making explicit, bootstrapping enterprise and making explicit. But the reason for that is because I think it helpfully articulates or makes explicit certain features of our practice, but not because I'm taking the base vocabulary to be metaphysically privileged. And so it'd be a way of saying, yes, I'm really doing a project like that, but it doesn't support Hugh's interpretation, in which case I'm not sure Hugh and you are very close at all, contrary to what he thinks. Or what you could say is, no, I really do think that this dissipates the mystery to show that this base vocabulary, which we have independent reasons for thinking doesn't involve the same kind of metaphysical commitment, is the one that we're taking as primary. We're explicating everything in terms of that, in which case it does seem like there's room for Hugh to press the question with some urgency. But then how is that consistent with the more liberal Kantian Fregean attitude? Sorry that took so long.
Let me try first, but then certainly. Well, that's very clear, and I think that is helpful. And look, it's the Kant-Frege line that I want to take, and you're right. There's another strain in making it explicit. I don't understand that as responding to a problem of the puzzlingness of intentional vocabulary. I don't think it's necessary in order to vindicate it that you be able to give an account of it in non-intentional terms. The only reason to do that is if you could, then there's a kind of enlightenment about the relation between vocabularies that it would be a shame to pass up. But that's not because there's a metaphysical privilege about it. It seemed to me that it actually was possible to say in a normative but not intentional vocabulary what you have to do to be deploying an intentional vocabulary. But if it turned out that that wasn't possible, I wouldn't say intentional vocabulary has not been vindicated. It's turned out that it's puzzling. There'd be a certain kind of illumination about it that we didn't have. But there's other vocabularies that are perfectly in order that we can't give a story about that. Well, maybe. I mean, I'm inclined to think that a certain kind of normative vocabulary is a universal pragmatic meta-language, meta-vocabulary. And if that's true, that's an interesting fact. But it's not a metaphysical fact, because pragmatic meta-vocabularies are different. So anyway, that's the side that I see myself as coming down on. Now, describing pragmatic meta-vocabularies is the business both Hugh and I are in. So, I think that does put us together. I'm worried that he does think, as I don't, that there's a, in principle, privileged vocabulary, that it's got to be, say, biology, or there's some real problem. How could critters like us do it? When I look at a hierarchy that has physics and biology and maybe normative vocabulary, I don't see any a priori reason to see where you ought to be able to get a bootstrapping pragmatic meta-vocabulary. And if it turns out that you can't get one that bootstraps, that you have to do it in here, well, that's a thing we find out too.
Hugh, would you like to comment?
I'm not sure I can say anything useful very directly, except to say that, I certainly want to distance myself from the idea that I'm committed to the claim that there's any a metaphysically privileged vocabulary in any sense, or that I see the project as being in any sense a reductive one rather than an explanatory one. It did occur to me that there's something that I could have done a bit earlier to perhaps try and make it a bit clearer how I see my project, by putting a bit more stress on the idea that my basic objection to Bob here was that he was being too ironic with respect to the use of modality in contemporary metaphysics. And one way of bringing out what I mean by that is to compare the case of modality and indexicals. I think most of us would think that if someone came along claiming to be a realist metaphysician about some topic and offered us a reduction of the facts in that area to indexical facts, we'd say, hang on, that's not basis for any sort of realism, because we now understand that indexical facts, that there aren't sort of objective indexical facts. Perry and Evans and Lewis and so on have shown us why we need to go in for indexical talk, but they've shown us why that's the case, despite the fact that we live in the world in which there's no privileged I, there's no privileged here, and as we now know, there's no privileged now either. And the last case is particularly interesting because we just have to look back, say, 150 years in the history of physics, and we come to a period when all the educated people took it for granted that now and the present and so on did, as it were, as we'd intuitively say, pick out some sort of objective feature of the physical world. And what the modern treatment of indexicals reveals, I think, is that at that period, physics was still stuck in what we might think of as a kind of pre-Copernican phase with respect to indexicality. Now, the project I'm interested in is the project of asking whether physics might also be stuck in a pre-Copernican phase with respect to modality, especially with respect to causality, but also with respect to other kinds of modality. And it seems to me that the analogies between the way in which Bob's project makes sense of the idea that there's no such thing as an autonomous vocabulary which is not doesn't have modal and normative and indeed indexical elements, kind of counts on my side in the sense that I can now appeal to the normative and the indexical cases and say, look, we're clear that the physical world doesn't contain those sorts of ingredients. So why can't we ask the question as to whether it doesn't contain modal ingredients as well? That seems to me to be a legitimate kind of question.
Please.
Sebastian Kołodziejczyk from Krakow. So my question is very close to the last one. It's very pity you omit Hegel in your lecture, because it will be a very good opportunity to learn something about the concept of mediation. And my question is connected with the concept of mediation. The classical metaphysics, also called traditional metaphysics, helpfully is looking for something which is ultimate reality, or something like the ultimate laws of reality. And these laws, or this reality, is given to the subject or given to the human being without any mediation. So my question is, how you imagine is something which is really not mediated, which is given not in the mediation in the sense of ultimate things, or something which is beyond the scope of pragmatical mediation, something like this in your theory?
Okay, I mean, I will say, I will take Hegel's name in vain in the next two lectures. I think mediation is his term for material inferential consequential relations, as determinate negation is his name for material, is his way of talking about material incompatibility relations. And I think he at least starts from the thought that the world is everything that is the case, the facts, not just a collection of objects. I mean, he thinks the fact, because he appreciates this claim about the necessary modal relations among facts, which underwrite our explanatory practices, he's not happy stopping at the level of facts. It's got to be something bigger than that, the concept, the idea, something like that. But Hegel certainly thinks that it's only in the context of things standing in relations of determinate negation and mediation to one another, things that are conceptually articulated, that we can talk sensibly either about a determinate thought or a determinate way the world is. So there isn't going to be anything that's simply immediate. Immediacy is at most going to talk about some aspect of this thoroughly mediated structure, whether we think of it from the side of our subjective activity or the objective world that we're working in.
Sebastian Rudel.
I really would have liked to hear the exchange continue that began after the first question with Hugh Price's distinguishing two ways of speaking of the world, and Bob Brandom thereby being made nervous. And in order perhaps to restart this exchange, I want to ask a question. I want to be a subjective naturalist, because when you're on the side of Darwin, and then you can't lose. So that seems great. But so what does the subjective naturalist think? I mean, you said that he thinks that we, or men, are in the order of nature. And so I just want to know what is the order of nature, and how do we know that we are in it?
First of all, the term I use is subject naturalist, not subjective naturalist. And I think there are important senses in which the view is not in any sense a subjective view, at least in terms of some of the things which are meant by that. And by the order of nature, I think for these purposes, I just mean the Darwinian order of nature. I mean, we are evolved products of what exists on the planet. Now, I can see that you don't think that that's satisfactory, but I don't know why not.
Any response?
Well, what does order mean? I mean, order does seem to refer to a certain kind of articulation of the way in which that which is called nature is represented. It's not supposed to be internal to it, that there's no local connection, that there's no order connection. So what does order mean, and how does it manage to describe a certain something that could deserve a name, such as nature, as opposed to non-nature? I mean, I don't understand.
Well, okay. I mean, I can't now remember who actually introduced the term order here, whether I had it or whether you introduced. But I don't think much hangs on it. I mean, just to repeat myself, I mean, all I mean is by subject naturalism is just the thought that we are biological creatures.
Just biological creatures?
Well, we're different from many biological creatures in interesting respects, but I don't think that means that the project of understanding the respects in which we're different from the others is not a biological project. I mean, after all, other biological creatures are different from biological creatures in general too, in various ways. And again, I think I want to, I mean, perhaps I should have done this more in the talk. I want to appeal to the two striking analogies which seem to me to come out of, as it were, Bob's project itself, in that he himself refers both to the normative case and to the indexical case. I mean, we can accept that our own linguistic practice is kind of essentially involves both elements, and yet it seems to me make pretty clear sense of the idea that in some sense our need to talk in that way is a sort of product of our circumstances rather than a product of the fact that we happen to inhabit a world which has those indexical and normative aspects to it. And as I said, the project that I want to encourage in the modal case too is the project of trying to explore the idea that at least some of the modal notions might be like that. I mean, I think causation is like that for quite specific reasons. I mean, I think causation is an essentially indexical notion. So I think there's a way of saying that, which I can go part of the way towards saying. I'm actually going to try to go part of the way towards saying it at a conference next weekend, which, as it were, tries to take causation down the path that people like Perry took the regular kinds of indexicals, i.e. offering us an explanation for why, as I would want to put it, creatures living in a non-indexical world should nevertheless need indexical representations in their systems of language and thought.
Great, last question, yes.
Bob, I was very sympathetic to your response to Hugh in trying to get out of the terms of the debate over naturalism up until the very end, when you insisted on the separation between biology and the social sciences. And I wonder why you want to commit yourself to a conception of biology that cuts off key parts, cuts off phenotypic plasticity and intricate involvement with the environment, and the sociality of human development, which incorporates growing up and developing as an organism in a linguistically articulated world from our biology. I think that conceding the notion of biology to a narrow, reductive conception that leaves out much of the crucial parts of contemporary biological thought is a serious mistake philosophically as well as biologically.
Well, it may just be, you might be entirely right, Joe, and I just might not know enough about contemporary biology. My take on it is that it is pretty reductive, that indeed contemporary biology has almost nothing to say about the new stuff that happens when biological critters start talking to each other. That's the point at which one needs to do anthropology, sociology, psychology, and so on. That's the point at which one really has a Geisteswissenschaft and not a Naturwissenschaft. And I read contemporary biology as absolutely committed to being a natural science in a way that involves a kind of reductive picture. Now, that may be, I mean, I might be wrong about it, but if that's the picture they have, that might be a terrible thing. But I meant to be describing sort of the actual biology that there is, rather than some utopian one that's spread to worry about this other stuff. But I do think that the principles of explanation that are abroad in biology are quite different from those that I think come into play with discursive cultural beings, and that biology has virtually nothing to tell us about discourse, about language. It can inform us about some of the necessary conditions thereof, but I don't see that we're going to learn much more about it, even, I think, from the neurophysiological side and studies of the brain, than we learn about discourse from the fact that, as far as we know, the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere is a necessary condition for discursive beings. Well, maybe that's true, but you don't learn anything about language, about discursive practice from that. So maybe I'm giving up too soon, but that was the thought.
Thank you. Well, that's it, I'm afraid, and thanks for coming. Thanks to our speakers.